A man named Arthur Walden crossed the main street of Dawson during the Yukon Gold Rush without muddying his shoes by hopping from one dead horse to the next. That was the road. That was how the street was maintained. And every single person who stepped off that street and walked into one of those frontier hotels carried every bit of it inside with them. We have been sold a version of the Old West that was built by people who needed you to move there. 19th century newspapers described mountain air with words like crystalline and exquisite purity. What they left out was the smell. What they left out was what was in the bed. What they left out was what happened to your body if you drank from the wrong watering hole between here and the next town. Every traveler who passed through the American West in the 1870s and 1880s faced the same biological gauntlet, and the specifics of what that looked like have been almost entirely buried beneath 100 years of Hollywood fiction. The Frontier Hotel sat at the center of this. Built fast, often of raw green lumber that warped and cracked within a single season, these structures could not be effectively cleaned. The walls held moisture. The floors held mud and manure tracked in from the street. The smell of rotting garbage and unwashed bodies settled into the timber and stayed there. A room that rented for $1 a night in 1875 smelled like the street it was built on because it was, in every biological sense, still part of it. What replaced this was not improvement, it was concealment. When the railroads arrived and brought with them the possibility of tourism, the same newspapers that had ignored the stench began describing those same mountains in language designed to sell land. The smell was still there. The sewer problem remained unsolved for years. The marketing simply got better. The bedbugs were there before you arrived, and they would be there after you left. The common name for them among travelers and soldiers in the 1870s was redcoats, a dark humor about the welts they left behind. The architecture of the Frontier Hotel was, unintentionally, a perfect incubator. Wooden frames, cracks and crevices in every wall, shared bedding that was never boiled between guests. The bug known to science as Cimex lectularius had everything it needed, and it had been there so long that experienced travelers treated infestation not as a surprise, but as a certainty. Hotel keepers fought back with turpentine, painting the wooden bed frames, pouring it into wall joints. Some used carbolic soap and scalding water on the frames between guests. In the worst cases, they sealed a room and burned sulfur inside it, filling the space with toxic sulfur dioxide gas. The room had to air for hours before anyone could re-enter safely. These were the treatments. They didn't work for long. Spooning, sleeping tightly packed against strangers in a shared bed, was not considered degrading in frontier lodging culture. It was considered standard. A traveler who paid for a bed in a roadhouse or stagecoach station in the 1870s was paying for a share of a bed. 3 men to a mattress was common. 4 was not unusual. The social code that governed this arrangement was unspoken but firm. You slept in your clothes, both for warmth and for the basic security of keeping your money and your boots on your body. You did not complain about who was next to you. The arrangement called top to tail, one man's feet near another man's head, was the preferred configuration when the bed held more than 2. It maximized space and minimized the particular discomfort of face-to-face contact with a stranger in the dark. It also distributed the smell more evenly. For women, the calculus was different. Isabella Bird documented in her letters from 1873 that even in the roughest frontier inns, her presence as a woman often produced a change in behavior among the men, what she called a restraining influence. The rougher talk quieted, the worst behavior pulled back. This did not mean she had a room to herself. It meant she had a corner separated from the rest of the sleeping area by whatever was available, a hanging sheet, a canvas partition, what one account describes as a chaste separating sword. Privacy in the Frontier Hotel was not a feature. It was a negotiation. The community toothbrush was not a metaphor. In stagecoach stations across the West, a single brush made of animal bristle hung near the wash basin for use by any traveler who wanted it. The common towel, a single strip of cloth hung near the bar, was used by dozens of men each day to wipe beer foam from their mustaches or trail dust from their hands and faces. Medical historians now identify both items as primary vectors for conjunctivitis and skin infections among the transient population. The men using them did not know this. The germ theory of disease was still making its way into frontier medicine. They used the brush. They used the towel. They moved on to the next town and left both behind. The record of frontier life that survived into the 20th century was not random. It was curated. The newspapers of the 1870s and 1880s functioned as what one historian calls image-making machinery for the territories they covered. Their survival depended on investment and settlement. A paper that ran detailed accounts of bedbug infestations and toxic water sources was a paper that discouraged the migration of exactly the people who needed to buy land and subscribe to the paper and spend money in the local stores. So those stories were minimized. The mountain fever outbreaks were called something else. The shared beds and the common toothbrush didn't make the copy. What made the copy was the scenery, the opportunity, the language of a fresh start in a pure land. Hollywood inherited this editorial tradition wholesale: the private room with the keyed door, the clean saloon, the bed that belonged to one person. These images were not accidents. They were the continuation of a promotional strategy that began in the frontier press and ended in the American imagination. The ledgers and diaries of the actual travelers told a different story. But ledgers don't get made into films. The knowledge of what that world actually was still exists in those primary sources. It exists in Isabella Bird's letters. It exists in Richard Burton's ethnographic notes. It exists in the medical records of military posts that tracked disease through the shared sleeping quarters of the West. It's still there. It just never made it into the myth. The water could kill you before you understood what was happening to you. Along a 30-mile stretch of trail in Wyoming, known informally as the Poison Spider Route, travelers encountered a series of alkali marshes, mineral-saturated pools that looked, in the right light, like viable water sources. They were not. The dissolved salts and minerals in those pools caused severe digestive distress and dehydration in both animals and humans. Oxen died at these watering holes. People got sick and then sicker. And then the sickness became something else entirely. What the settlers called mountain fever, blamed at the time on alkali dust in the air, on bad elevation, on miasma, on the mysterious moral dangers of the frontier, was, in significant part, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, a tick-borne illness that caused high fever, severe rash, and in many cases, death. The tiny tick that carried it lived in the blankets and bedding of frontier hotels. The sick traveler who arrived at one of these establishments after a week on the trail carried the pathogen into the shared sleeping quarters, and the shared sleeping quarters did the rest. The frontier hotel, built near the only available water sources in arid country, became a convergence point for exactly the conditions most likely to spread disease. Contaminated water nearby, no sanitation infrastructure, shared bedding between strangers, no understanding of how the illness actually traveled. A traveler named James Reed, passing through Wyoming in 1878, wrote in his journal that he had not slept a full night in 3 weeks, not because of the insects, not because of the strangers in the bed beside him, but because the man in the bunk above his had a fever that had not broken in 4 days, and everyone in the room knew it, and no one knew what to do. At the other end of the economic spectrum, 60 miles east of where Reed was writing, the Cheyenne Club stood 3 stories tall with a mansard roof and a wraparound veranda. Built for the cattle barons who had made their fortunes on the open range, it was by any measure of the era opulent. Fine imported furnishings, dining service, private rooms with actual doors. The cost of a night at the Cheyenne Club was not $1. It was not shared with anyone. The men who stayed there were not reading their shirts by lamplight looking for lice. That world, the world the films show, existed. It existed for a very small number of people, and those people were very aware of the distance between their experience and the experience of everyone else. The term was reading your shirt, and every man in a frontier bunkhouse or hotel loft knew exactly what it meant. At night, before sleep, a man would hold his shirt close to the candle flame, and work slowly along the seams, the collar, the cuffs, the underarms, picking out the body lice, called seam squirrels by soldiers and cowboys alike, one by one. This was not an occasional precaution. It was a nightly ritual. The lice lived specifically in the seams because the seam provided cover and warmth and constant proximity to skin. A man who skipped the reading went to bed with them. A man who did it carefully might get 2 or 3 hours before they were back. The contrast with this picture, quiet, candlelit, the careful work of a man trying to get enough relief to sleep, against the image we've been given of the frontier hotel, the private room, the clean bed, the peaceful rest of the righteous, is not incidental. It is the whole of it. The Wild West was not a place where strong men rested easily. It was a place where ordinary people applied specific, hard-won knowledge to the problem of staying alive and functional in conditions that were genuinely hostile to both. The seam squirrel was a small enemy, but the act of fighting it, patiently, nightly, by candlelight in a room full of strangers, is a more accurate portrait of that world than anything Hollywood ever put on a screen. These were the actual conditions of that actual world, and the people who navigated them did so without the comfort of knowing it would ever get better. What they had was the specific knowledge of exactly where the danger was, and the discipline to deal with it every single night before they tried to sleep. That knowledge deserves more than a myth. It deserves the truth. Tell me in the comments, did you grow up hearing stories about the real West? Not the Hollywood version, but the actual one? What did the people in your family say about what that life was really like?